The two children lie head to head in a narrow trench in the frozen ground. They are maybe 10 and 12 years old. They are covered from skull to foot in beads carved out of mammoth ivory. Not a handful, not a necklace. Roughly 5,000 beads on one child and roughly 5,400 on the other. Every single one of those beads was cut from ivory by hand, shaped and drilled through the middle with a stone point. There is no machine anywhere on Earth. There will not be one for another 30,000 years. Experimental archaeologists have sat down and made these beads the old way with the old tools and timed themselves. The estimates run from about 45 minutes per bead at the fast end to more than an hour at the careful end. So do the arithmetic, 10,400 beads, somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour of work apiece. That is somewhere around 8,000 to 10,000 hours of human labor poured into two dead children by people who lived in an ice age and had to kill large animals to eat. And that is only the beads. Beside the children lie spears made from the tusks of mammoths, tusks that curve, that have been made straight. The longest is close to 8 feet of solid, straightened ivory. Nobody has fully explained how it was done. This place is called Sunghir. It sits on the edge of the city of Vladimir, about 100 miles east of Moscow, and it was found in the 1950s when a clay pit for a brick factory cut into the hillside. It is around 34,000 years old, and it is the single most expensive funeral in the entire Stone Age. Meet Aska. Aska is a device, a name I'm putting on a person we can't name because somebody made these beads and that somebody was real. Everything Aska does in this story is something we know was done at Sunghir. We just don't know who did it. Start with the ground itself. Sunghir is not a cave. It's an open-air camp on a slope above a small river in a landscape that in the Ice Age is cold, dry, treeless steppe. There are mammoth here and reindeer and horse and Arctic fox and wolf and cave lion. There is not much wood. Fires burn bone. The winters are long and the people are living at the edge of what a body can take. This is a working camp, not a shrine. There are hearths, there are stone tools, there is butchered animal bone in quantity, the ordinary debris of people getting through a winter. The stone toolkit here is unusual enough that specialists group it with something called the Strzeleckian, an Eastern European tradition with distinctive triangular points. These aren't strangers passing through. They lived here on this slope above this river. Excavation ran on and off from the late 1950s into the 1970s under the archaeologist Otto Bader, and what came out of that trench rewrote what people thought the Stone Age was. 7 individuals in all have been identified from the site. 4 of them were deliberately buried. 2 had their remains handled and moved after death. 1 got little or no formal treatment at all. Hold on to that. Most people at Sunghir did not get a grave. That is going to matter later. The first grave holds a man. Researchers call him Sunghir 1. Current work puts him in his late 30s to mid-40s, which is old for this world. He is laid out on his back, arms straight, and he's wearing about 3,000 ivory beads and 25 bracelets carved from mammoth ivory. There are a dozen pierced fox teeth across his forehead from a cap or a headband, and there is a cut mark on his first thoracic vertebra, the bone at the base of the neck. Somebody put a blade into this man's throat, and that is what killed him. That is what the bone says. The second grave is the one that changed everything. 2 children head to head in a single narrow trench. Sunghir 2 is the older, around 12. Sunghir 3 is the younger, around 10. They were put in the ground at the same time in one event and covered in red ochre. Each of them has a human fibula, a calf bone from some other person laid across the chest. And laid alongside the older child is a fourth thing that is hard to look at calmly. A human thigh bone, both ends cut off, the hollow shaft packed full of red ochre and set into the grave like an object. That femur belongs to a fourth person entirely. Researchers call it Sunghir 4. These people are not simply burying their dead, they're composing something. Now the beads, this is where the episode actually lives. A Sunghir bead is small, a rough disc or a barrel of mammoth ivory, a centimeter or less across with a hole through it. To make one, you start with mammoth ivory, which is not like bone. Ivory is layered and it splits along those layers if you push it wrong. So first you have to get a workable blank off the tusk, splitting, sawing with a stone edge, wedging. Then you shape it, then hardest of all, you drill it. You are boring a hole roughly 1 millimeter or 2 wide through a hard, brittle, layered material, using a stone point turned by hand. Push too hard and the bead shatters and the work is gone. Researchers have done this. They've replicated the tools and the material and the technique and put a clock on it. The published estimates land somewhere between roughly 45 minutes and over an hour of work for a single finished bead. Let's be honest about the range. Different experimenters get different numbers because one bead hides a lot, how much prep of the raw tusk you count, how skilled the maker is, how many blanks crack. So we'll do the math both ways, and neither way is comfortable. The counts themselves vary a little by who's counting and whether fragments get tallied. The adult grave runs to around 3,000 beads, the older child around 5,000, the younger child around 5,400. Call the site total about 13,000. Some counts say 13,100, some say 13,400. Nobody serious disputes the order of magnitude. Take the 2 children alone, 10,400 beads. At 45 minutes each, that's about 7,800 hours. At an hour each, it's 10,400 hours. Add the adult and the whole site sits somewhere between 10 and 13,000 hours of skilled handwork. Now turn that into something a human being can feel. 10,000 hours done by one person working 8 hours a day, every single day with no days off, is about 3 years and 5 months. But nobody in this world gets to work 8 hours a day on beads. There's hunting. There's butchering, hide-working, hauling water, keeping a fire alive on bone in a place with almost no wood. If a person can spare 1 hour a day for beadwork, 10,000 hours takes more than 27 years. That's a working lifetime. So this is not one person's project. It's a group effort, and a long one. 10 people at 4 hours a day still need most of a year. And think about who can do this work. Bead making is sit-down work. It's done close to a fire in poor light with the hands. It doesn't need a strong back or good knees or the ability to run down a reindeer. It needs patience and steady fingers and a lot of hours nobody else wants. That's the shape of the winter in a place like this, long, dark, not much you can do outside, and a group sitting around a bone fire waiting for the light to come back. It's exactly the labor an Ice Age society has to spare. Which is part of the answer and also makes the total more impressive, not less, because the beads are what they chose to do with the only free time they had. There's also breakage to account for. Every experimenter who has tried this loses blanks, ivory splits along its layers, and a bead that cracks at the drilling stage takes all its previous work with it. So the honest labor figure isn't 13,000 beads made, it's 13,000 beads that survived being made, and here's the part that stops the easy explanation. The obvious dodge is to say the beads weren't made for the funeral, that they were already sewn onto clothing the children wore in life, and the clothing just went into the ground with them. That's plausible, and it may well be part of the answer. But the beads on the children are noticeably smaller than the beads on the adult, about 2/3 the size. They were made at child scale for child-sized garments, which means somebody produced tens of thousands of hours worth of ornament sized specifically to bodies that had existed for 10 years. And smaller beads are not less work. A smaller bead is harder to hold, harder to drill without splitting, and you need more of them to cover the same amount of cloth. Whichever way you run it, this society took a colossal share of its available skilled labor and put it on 2 children. That's the fact. Everything else is interpretation. Then there are the spears. 16 of them in the burials made of mammoth ivory, 5 of them pointed at both ends. They range from about 11 inches long up to a little over 8 feet. The longest lie with the children. Now think about what a mammoth tusk actually is. It's a curve. A big tusk sweeps around in an arc. That's its whole shape. A straight lance 8 feet long, cut from a curved tusk, is a problem in geometry before it's anything else. There are 2 broad answers, and archaeologists still argue about which one applies here. One is that you carve straight out of the curve, which wastes an enormous amount of a very valuable material and limits how long a straight piece you can get. The other is that the ivory was softened by soaking, by heat, by some treatment, and then straightened and allowed to set. Both have been proposed. The evidence for whole tusks being softened this early is thin, and some specialists are openly skeptical. What isn't in doubt is the result. The spears exist, they're straight and they're long, and every one of them represents days of work on a material that punishes mistakes. And they may not be ceremonial props. Materials testing on late Pleistocene weapon stock has found that mammoth ivory matches antler for bending strength and resistance to fracture, while being denser and stiffer, a solid shaft where antler is partly porous. And it comes in a size nothing else does. On a treeless steppe where there's no good spear wood for 100 miles, a mammoth tusk is the only place a person can get 8 feet of straight, rigid weapon. 5 of the Sunghir pieces are pointed at both ends, which is a design that shows up elsewhere in this period and whose function nobody has pinned down. These could be real hunting weapons that were retired into a grave. They could be objects built to look like weapons. The grave doesn't say, and the beads and spears are only the headline. The older child wears a belt of more than 250 pierced Arctic fox canine teeth and has more than 40 more across the top of the skull from a cap. A fox has 4 canines. So that belt alone means dozens of foxes trapped or hunted, their jaws worked, each tooth pulled and then drilled, and drilling a tooth is its own way to lose an hour. There are carved ivory bracelets, at least 8 on one child, at least 13 on the other, 25 on the adult. There are pierced antler batons of a type whose purpose is still argued over, decorated with rows of dots. There are ivory discs cut through with lattice patterns, thin as a wafer and fragile as a leaf. There's a small carved mammoth figurine and a flat ivory animal pendant, and over all of it red ochre, a lot of it, ground and carried and spread over the bodies. Ochre has to be found, dug, transported, and often heated to get the color. Trinkaus and Buzhalova note that the amount at Sunghir is actually about average for burials of this period, which is its own quiet piece of information. The ochre is normal, the beads are not. Whatever this community had in the way of spare capacity, the hours not spent staying alive, a startling share of it ended up in this trench. Here's where the simple story breaks. The easy reading is rich kids. High-status family, inherited rank, wealth on display, the Ice Age version of a royal tomb. It's a tidy story and it's probably wrong or at least badly incomplete. The first crack is in the younger child's legs. Sunghir 3 has femora, thigh bones that are markedly short and bowed forward in a smooth curve along the whole shaft, deepest at the middle. Both legs symmetrically to the same degree. Nothing else in a very well-preserved skeleton is abnormal. That symmetry is the diagnostic point. 2 identically bowed femora aren't 2 identical accidents. Formikola and Buzhalova worked through the alternatives: old midshaft fractures, plastic bowing from injury, a cramped position in the womb, and concluded that a condition present from birth is the best explanation. Both children also carry rows of enamel defects in their teeth, the marks a body leaves when growth keeps getting interrupted by illness or hunger. These were not easy childhoods. Whatever else the beads mean, they don't mean comfort. But be careful here, because the follow-up work complicates the complication. When Cowgill, Mednikova, and colleagues looked at how the rest of the skeleton was loaded, the strength of the shin bones, the left-right asymmetry, the angle where the femur meets the knee, the pattern came out normal. This child walked and walked a lot and carried weight on both legs like anybody else. The bones were the wrong shape and the body used them anyway. So the popular headline, "Disabled child buried like a king," is doing too much work. There's a real skeletal abnormality. There's very little evidence it stopped the child living an ordinary physical life. The second crack is bigger, and it comes from genetics. In 2017, a team led by Martin Sikora and Esk Willerslev published complete genomes from 4 Sunghir individuals in the journal Science. The adult, both children, and that ochre-packed femur laid beside them. Everyone expected family. 2 children in one grave head to head with an adult a few steps away and a human thigh bone deliberately included. Brothers, surely. A father and his sons. That is not what the DNA says. None of the four are close relatives, not siblings, not parent and child, not even uncle and nephew. At the very closest, second cousins. The two children buried head to head in a single grave were not brothers. The DNA carried a second surprise. Sunghir 3 had been read as a girl for decades on the shape of the skeleton, and a lot of the older literature says she. The genomes came back male for all four individuals sequenced. Sexing a 10-year-old skeleton from its shape is genuinely hard because the features that separate male from female mostly arrive at puberty. So the genetic result is the stronger evidence, but you'll still find the older reading in print, and it's worth knowing why the two disagree. Now the part that matters most. The genomes also showed how little inbreeding these people carried. They came from a population with a small effective size, not many people, spread very thin across an enormous landscape. In a situation like that, if people simply married whoever was nearby, the genomes would be full of the signature of close-kin pairings. They aren't. Willerslev's group put it plainly. If mating had been random within these small bands, they would see far more inbreeding than they found, which means somebody was keeping track. The picture that fits is the one living hunter-gatherers show us, bands of roughly 25 people, tied into a wider network of maybe a couple of hundred, with rules about who can pair with whom, and deliberate exchange of partners between groups. That requires knowing your relatives by name across several groups. It requires holding kinship in your head as a system, and honoring it when it's inconvenient. 34,000 years ago on the Russian plain, and think about what that costs to maintain. 200 people spread across a landscape this empty are not in daily contact. Somebody has to travel. Somebody has to remember who is descended from whom, going back generations in groups they see once a year at best. Somebody has to negotiate and be understood, which means shared language across the whole network, not just inside the camp. And this is where the ornament stops looking decorative. Researchers have suggested that band-specific styles of beadwork may be doing exactly this job, marking who belongs to which group, visible from a distance before anybody speaks. A study published in 2025, looking at how the Sunghir beads were strung, found deliberate structure in the sequences, beads sorted by shape and size, arranged in patterns, some strings graded from large to small, some built around a marked center. That isn't random spillage. That's a design being followed, and the same principle turns up in contemporary sites more than 1,000 miles west in southern Germany. The beads may not be wealth at all. They may be identity, a person's group, written on their body in ivory, in a world where knowing which group somebody came from decided whether you could marry them. So what do you do with all that? Start by refusing the easy answer. Grave goods are not a bank statement. There's a long-running argument in archaeology about whether what's in a grave tells you about the dead person or about the living people doing the burying, and it's not settled. A funeral can be a statement about lineage, about a debt, about fear, about a community proving something to itself. The dead don't dress themselves, and the Sunghir pattern doesn't behave like a status ranking. Trinkaus and Buzhalova pointed out that across burials of this period, Individuals with marked developmental or degenerative abnormalities are strikingly common, something like a third of the well-preserved ones. If elaborate burial tracked rank, you wouldn't expect that. What you might be looking at instead is a society that buried the unusual death, the person whose end was wrong somehow, the body that didn't fit. Remember that most people at Sunghir got no grave at all. Being buried here isn't the reward for being important. It's what happens to a particular kind of death. And then there's the darkest reading, which we should state and then handle carefully. Vincenzo Formicola argued in 2007 that the pattern across several Upper Paleolithic sites, young people, unusual body positions, physical anomalies, multiple burials made in a single event might point to human sacrifice. Sunghir is one of his examples. The two children died at the same time, or close enough that they went into the ground together, which is not what you expect from two unrelated children in a small band. And the adult in the next grave has a blade cut on the vertebra at the base of his neck. That is a real pattern and it deserves a hearing. It is also not established and it should not be repeated as fact. There are ordinary explanations for two children dying together in an ice age winter: illness, cold, an accident, hunger. The sacrifice reading is a hypothesis with some suggestive circumstantial support and no direct proof. Anyone who tells you Sunghir proves human sacrifice is telling you more than the evidence allows. Here's what does survive all the arguing. These people were spread thin across a brutal landscape and were living close to the edge, and they still knew their kin well enough to avoid marrying them across a network wider than their own camp. They still put somewhere between 10 and 13,000 hours of skilled work into ornament, and they put a huge share of that onto two children who weren't related to each other, one of whom had legs that grew wrong. Whatever the beads mean, they weren't paying for personal achievement. 10-year-olds haven't achieved anything yet. The beads are the community saying something about itself, about what it owed or feared or wanted the world to understand. And the dating tells you how early this is. The radiocarbon on Sunghir has been through the ringer, because glue used on the bones in the 1960s contaminated the early samples and gave dates that were far too young. Chemists eventually solved it by dating a single amino acid out of the collagen, hydroxyproline, which can only have come from the bone itself. Those results cluster around 30,000 radiocarbon years, which calibrates to somewhere near 34,000 calendar years ago. Different studies still give slightly different windows, and a recent reassessment favors the younger end of the range. The honest statement is somewhere in the low 30,000s and older than people thought for most of the 20th century. That's before the cave paintings at Lascaux by roughly 17,000 years. It is more than 20,000 years before anybody plants a crop anywhere on this planet. And already there are rules about who you can marry, and a technology of ornament sophisticated enough to burn 10,000 hours, and a funeral complex enough that we're still arguing about what it meant. We tend to picture the deep past as a struggle for calories with the culture bolted on later, once there was time. Sunghir says the opposite. The culture is not what you build after you're safe. It's what these people spent their margin on when they were never safe. 10,000 hours, two children who weren't brothers.